Today's story centers on one of the most dramatic and consequential shifts inside NATO in many years. What started as a quiet disagreement, hidden behind diplomatic smiles and press-ready statements, has now exploded into a public fracture. A group of influential European nations has openly defied direct US military requests, sending shockwaves through Western capitals and raising serious questions about the future of the alliance. This moment is not simply a disagreement over tactics or logistics. It is a direct challenge to long-standing assumptions about who leads NATO, how decisions are made, and how united the West actually is in the face of rising global threats. In the next several minutes, we're going to walk through exactly what happened, why it happened, and why leaders around the world are now watching this situation with deep concern. The tension began earlier this month when the United States issued a new series of military directives to its NATO allies. These directives included a notable increase in troop deployments to Eastern Europe, expanded surveillance operations along NATO's borders, and new commitments tied to ongoing conflicts in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. Historically, US leadership within NATO meant that when Washington made a recommendation, the alliance typically followed it, sometimes with hesitation, but usually without direct confrontation. This time, however, was different. Several European countries immediately expressed discomfort, not publicly, but privately in diplomatic channels. They argued that Washington was making decisions without proper consultation and that Europe was once again being asked to shoulder risks and responsibilities that primarily served US interests. Diplomats involved in the early discussions described the mood as deeply divided. Some meetings reportedly ended with raised voices, long silences, and a sense that something fundamental was breaking. For years, European governments have quietly complained that Washington dominates NATO decision-making. But until now, those frustrations never translated into open defiance. This time, however, the stakes were different. The new US directives required Europe to absorb major economic costs, military risks, and political consequences at a moment when many European countries were already struggling with domestic crises. The situation eventually became impossible to hide when a bloc of European nations, believed to include France, Germany, and several smaller states, collectively refused to follow the new US military instructions. Their rejection was firm, coordinated, and carefully timed. In statements that were diplomatic but unmistakably confrontational, these governments argued that the United States was escalating too quickly, asking for commitments that Europe simply could not sustain. They insisted that NATO decisions must be made collectively, and that Europe should not be expected to automatically align with Washington's strategic priorities, especially when those priorities placed European security at greater risk. This was a major turning point. For the first time in many years, Europe openly questioned the balance of power within NATO. The message from European capitals was clear. Washington's leadership is not being rejected outright, but it is no longer unquestioned. To understand why Europe pushed back so forcefully, we need to look at several underlying pressures that have been building for years. The first major factor is economic pressure. European economies have been under strain from multiple directions: high energy costs, inflation, declining industrial output, and widespread public dissatisfaction. Governments that are already struggling to pay for social services, energy subsidies, and debt obligations found it difficult to justify a sudden increase in military spending driven by US decisions. Leaders argued that their economies simply cannot absorb another round of expensive commitments without risking political collapse at home. The second factor is what many analysts are calling strategic fatigue. After years of involvement in foreign conflicts, sanctions, military buildups, and diplomatic standoffs, many European governments and citizens feel exhausted. There is a growing belief among voters that Europe should pursue diplomatic solutions rather than escalating tensions. This shift in public mood has put enormous pressure on political leaders to slow down, rethink priorities, and avoid being dragged into new crises that they did not initiate. The third factor is political change. Across Europe, populist movements, anti-war parties, and economically focused political groups have gained significant influence. These groups argue that Europe has spent too much time following Washington's lead, often at the expense of its own security and prosperity. As elections approach in multiple European countries, leaders are increasingly aware that their political survival may depend on distancing themselves from US military ambitions. The pushback against Washington is not only strategic, it is also political. Together, these pressures created the strongest challenge to US leadership in NATO in over a decade, and Washington's reaction has reportedly been a mix of surprise, frustration, and concern. For decades, the United States has relied on NATO unity as a stabilizing force in global politics, but this sudden resistance threatens that stability. American officials worry that if one bloc refuses, others may follow. Smaller NATO members, who usually follow the lead of larger European nations, may begin questioning their own commitments as well. And if multiple countries start charting independent paths, the very structure of NATO could be called into question. Behind the scenes, the United States has reportedly issued warnings. Officials argue that hesitation or division within NATO could embolden rival powers, weaken deterrence, and create vulnerabilities that adversaries might exploit. Washington insists that unity is essential, especially in a world where geopolitical competition is intensifying. However, Europe remains firm. Leaders across the continent have insisted that decisions affecting the entire alliance cannot be dictated by one country, even if that country is the United States. This fracture has raised profound questions about the future of NATO. For many years, the alliance has operated under a clear understanding. The United States sets strategic direction. Europe provides support, and together, they maintain Western dominance. But today's crisis suggests that this model may no longer be sustainable. Europe is becoming more assertive, more independent, and more willing to challenge Washington openly. Across European capitals, debates are now underway about the role Europe wants to play in global security. Should Europe continue relying on the United States for strategic direction? Or should it build its own independent defense framework, one that reflects European interests rather than American priorities? This question is not new, but the current crisis has brought it to the forefront in a way that cannot be ignored. Some European leaders argue that the continent must reduce dependence on the United States if it wants true strategic autonomy. They say Europe needs its own military doctrine, its own defense coordination, and its own ability to act without waiting for Washington's approval. Others worry that weakening ties with the US would leave Europe vulnerable. They argue that NATO unity is essential and that division only benefits countries that want to undermine Western influence. The real issue is that Europe is divided internally. While some nations want more independence from the US, others are deeply aligned with Washington and fear losing American support. This internal division makes it even more difficult for NATO to function effectively. As Europe debates its future, Washington is watching closely. The United States relies heavily on NATO as both a military tool and a political tool. If Europe begins pulling away, US influence could decline, not just in Europe, but globally. Beyond the political implications, there are important military consequences as well. NATO's strength has always depended on coordination, shared intelligence, unified command structures, and clear chains of decision-making. When countries break from those structures, operational efficiency suffers. Intelligence sharing becomes more complicated. Joint missions become harder to coordinate. And adversaries who study NATO closely may try to exploit these divisions. The question now is what happens next? Will the US compromise to keep Europe unified? Will Europe stand firm and force Washington to adjust its strategy? Or will this fracture escalate into a larger crisis that reshapes the entire alliance? At the moment, there is no clear answer. But one thing is certain. The old assumptions about NATO unity and automatic alignment with Washington are no longer reliable. As the situation continues to evolve, leaders around the world are paying close attention. Russia, China, and other global powers view NATO unity as a major obstacle to their ambitions. A divided NATO could shift global power dynamics in unpredictable ways. If Europe becomes more independent, its diplomatic approach may differ significantly from Washington's. A more cautious diplomatic Europe could pursue negotiations and compromise, while the US continues favoring pressure and confrontation. This divergence could reshape how global conflicts are managed. For now, Europe's refusal to follow US military orders marks a turning point. It represents a growing belief among European leaders that they must prioritize domestic needs, economic realities, and political pressures over alliance expectations. It also reflects a deeper shift in global politics, one in which alliances that once seemed permanent are now being tested, questioned, and reshaped. This story is still developing, and its consequences will be felt for years. Whether this becomes a temporary disagreement or the beginning of a new geopolitical era remains unknown. But one undeniable fact stands out. Europe is no longer automatically following Washington's lead. Something fundamental has changed inside NATO, and the world is watching closely to see where this historic fracture leads.